Well, thank you to the association, to Phil and Bonnie and everyone else. I see a lot of names of folks that I know. It's not only been 40 years since the organization was formed, but probably about 40 years since the first time I talked with you. And as you can see from a couple of pictures of me that appeared in that very, very nice tribute, there was more hair then than there is now, but at least for the moment, the rest of me seems to be intact. So we'll just keep our fingers crossed. I'm going to talk today about the emerging similarities between long COVID and ME/CFS. When COVID hit, it was very interesting to me because I thought there was a possibility that it would leave in its wake additional cases of ME/CFS or an illness very much like ME/CFS. And in fact, Dr. Bateman and I, in 2020, is just after the pandemic began, published a paper predicting that that might happen, and it obviously has. The question is there any good news in the bad news that so many people, as a result of COVID, are suffering similar symptoms? And that's what I'm going to try to address today. So let me pull up my slides. So the topics I want to cover today are the different consequences of COVID-19, the similarity in symptoms, the similarity in underlying physical abnormalities, the size of the problem for society, a theory about what is causing the symptoms of both ME/CFS and long COVID, and as Phil did, a list of the important unresolved questions. COVID, as you know, can produce different kinds of illnesses at different points in time. At the beginning, acute COVID can cause terrible illness requiring hospitalization. Less well known is that in the people who have recovered from acute COVID, even in people who were not very sick with acute COVID, there is an increase in a number of conventional diseases that is caused by the fact that the virus has caused injury throughout the body that makes the body more vulnerable to those diseases. What are some examples? This is a huge study, 73,000 people who had COVID compared with 5 million people who didn't have COVID. So a study you can trust the numbers from. Heart attack rates in the year following COVID. This is in people who never had these diseases before. Heart attack rates 2 times higher. Lung failure rates 4 times higher. Diabetes 1.5 times higher. The risk of premature death over 1.5 times higher. And then there is the lingering illness characterized by fatigue, cognitive problems, pain, other symptoms that we call long COVID. So what about that illness? What are the symptoms of it and how do they compare with the symptoms of ME/CFS? This is a summary of multiple studies involving 250,000 people. And it shows that 6 months after COVID, a very substantial fraction have the symptoms: fatigue, pain, disordered sleep, dyspnea or shortness of breath, difficulty concentrating, and reduced function, and reduced mobility, and reduced exercise tolerance. 2 years after COVID, just showed you 6 months after, 2 years after, still a lot of people who report fatigue, weakness, sleep disorders, palpitations, aching muscles. And to do the study properly, they compared how frequent those symptoms were in people who'd had COVID compared with people who had not had COVID, who have some of these same symptoms. And you can see the frequency in people with COVID is much higher than in people who never had COVID. How often does this lingering illness following COVID actually meet the case definition, the criteria for ME/CFS? One study estimates that it's about 13 to 25% of the patients. So not everyone with lingering fatigue and cognitive problems after COVID fully meets the case definition for ME/CFS, but many do. Now let's compare the symptoms a little more directly. Here I'm showing on the left column the symptoms in people with ME/CFS, and then in the right column, people with long COVID, LC. And as you see, and not surprisingly, fatigue, post-exertional malaise, headache, sleep disorder, impaired cognition, problems with memory and attention, depression, you can read them all. They are all shared by both illnesses. And that's been clear really since, I would say, the early fall of 2020. Before we even had a vaccine, it was clear, it was becoming clear to many people, myself included, that there was this illness that looked a lot like ME/CFS with many of the same symptoms. Only real difference is that with long COVID, problems of smell and taste, speech, and hair loss and rash are more common, more prominent than they are with ME/CFS. As for ability to function, there is a well-used instrument that measures functional status. It has 8 different subscales. They're arrayed here in this slide. And the subscales, the higher your score on a subscale, the better your level of function. The point the slide makes as it compares healthy control subjects, which are in green, people with long COVID in orange, and people with ME/CFS in red, is that people with long COVID and ME/CFS have much lower functional scores than healthy controls, with one exception, which is here under emotional health. There's really no difference in emotional health functional scores between long COVID, ME/CFS, and normal controls. In an illness, if ME/CFS and long COVID were caused primarily by emotional disturbances, as some people have argued, you would expect to see a lot better emotional function scores in healthy people compared with these 2 other groups. You don't see that. So there's clear impairment of function in both groups, very similar to one another. ME/CFS in general is a little worse than long COVID. What about, we're talking about ME/CFS and long COVID, but the fact is there are other illnesses that are followed by a very similar set of symptoms. A lot of other infections, for example. We know that in many, but not all, people with ME/CFS, it all seems to have begun with an infectious-like illness. Respiratory symptoms, abdominal symptoms, aching muscles, fever, other symptoms. Long COVID obviously began with acute COVID, with an infection with a particular virus. But in addition to these 2 conditions, very similar chronically fatiguing conditions have been described, following all sorts of different infections with viruses, bacteria, even protozoa. So following infections, at least certain well-documented infections, as well as COVID, you see lingering fatigue syndromes. You also see that, although I won't talk about it today, in some people following major physical trauma. The question is, do long COVID and ME/CFS, although they share many symptoms, actually have the same underlying biological abnormalities? Because you can have many different underlying abnormalities causing the same symptoms. Just because the symptoms are shared doesn't mean that they share the same underlying abnormalities. We didn't know anything about that, I would argue, until halfway through this year, 2022. But it's becoming pretty apparent that they share many of the same underlying biological abnormalities, as well as sharing many of the same symptoms. They have an infectious trigger. They share abnormal autonomic nervous system function, autoantibodies, or a kind of autoimmune process. They both seem to have trouble making enough energy molecules. Both conditions produce a hypometabolic state, including in the brain. They both produce oxidative stress, mast cell activation. They both apparently involve abnormalities of the gut microbiome and abnormalities on exercise testing and abnormalities of the way the small blood vessels function and reactivation of latent herpes viruses. And we can go on. There are a lot of abnormalities, not all. There are some that have not yet been reported as shared between the two illnesses, but many shared underlying abnormalities. So there seems no doubt that there are these underlying measurable objective abnormalities in both conditions. The question is, how do they lead to the symptoms and how do they affect each other? Because they do, many of them, affect each other. Oxidative stress, for example, can produce abnormal energy generation by mitochondria, and vice versa. And inflammation in the body can affect both of these things. In other words, they affect each other, which means that if something happens to make one abnormal, it then can trigger a series of dominoes that makes other things abnormal, which sets up vicious cycles where something gets worse and so something else gets worse, which means something else gets worse. It's a very complicated process that is going on in the body. But the good news from it is that if you could really reach in and intervene and stop one of those abnormalities cold, it might also improve a lot of the other abnormalities. So from the standpoint of a doctor or biomedical scientist, this is a biologically interesting problem. Now, what about from the standpoint of society? Should society, for example, be spending much money on research into this problem? After all, we're medical research. We're afflicted with so many medical problems for which we don't have answers right now, all of which are in need of more resources to study them. Is this a problem, as much suffering as it causes, that really is big enough for society to spend more research money on? Here are 4 recent reports from eminent economics organizations, the Brookings Institution, the CDC, National Center for Health Statistics, household surveys, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and an analysis by two eminent economists, David Cutler and Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury, former head of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. What do they say is happening to the economy as a result of long COVID? 16 million adults in the United States appear to have post-COVID illness that is causing 2 to 4 million of them to be out of work because of it. That's 1.8% of the total civilian labor force. It may be that it is these people who are accounting for the fact that there are so many more jobs than there are applicants for jobs in this country, which is dragging on the economy. The annual cost of foregone wages caused by this is estimated to be $170 to $230 billion. The annual cost of medical care and other for these illnesses is another $544 billion. And the aggregate cost just to the United States over the next 5 years is estimated to be $3.7 trillion. That would be a hit to the economy as great as the Great Recession of 2008, 9, and 10. So is it a big problem? Yes. Currently, it's also a big problem for the disability system. Right now, there are about 8 million people who are disabled and receiving disability through Social Security. If 7 more million develop disabilities from long COVID, which is a conservative projection, that nearly doubles the number of people receiving disability in this country. And that's going to be a huge load for a system, the disability system, that has shrunk the number of staff and closed 67 offices over the past decade. What's happening by way of federal research? Well, the good news is that the government is spending much more money in the next year on long COVID than it has ever spent collectively in the last 40 years. Over $1 billion in research. That's a lot of money for any given topic in medical research. On the other hand, as the economists say, when you're dealing with a $3.7 trillion problem, it's not such a big deal to spend $1 billion trying to figure it out. NIH has assembled a multi-center national cohort of cases of acute COVID, about 20,000 adults, 20,000 kids. That is, I should say, it's assembling it. It hasn't, they haven't all been recruited yet by any means. They're all being followed forward in time, prospectively, with standardized collection of clinical information, laboratory tests, and various biosamples. That's exactly what I think needs to be done. They're going to measure the evolution of symptoms after acute COVID and the underlying biologic abnormalities. And the hope is that what they learn about long COVID will have applicability to ME/CFS. My guess is it will. Now, how do the COVID virus and other microbes cause illness? How do microbes of various sorts play a role in long COVID specifically? Well, The obvious microbe is the virus that causes COVID in the first place, SARS-CoV-2. It's also becoming clear that latent viruses that lie asleep in virtually all of our bodies for all of our lives, like the herpes viruses, of which Epstein-Barr virus is one example, that these viruses also may be contributing to long COVID. And then lastly, there are all of the bacteria and possibly other microbes that live in our bodies all of our lives, mostly in our gut. Our microbiome is what we call all of their genes collectively. All of these different microbes appear involved in causing long COVID. How do they cause the symptoms of long COVID or of ME/CFS? Now we're getting into theory that I'd like to discuss briefly. It's, I should say, an unproven theory, but it's a theory that's not out of thin air. It's made plausible by a lot of scientific research. And it begins with this question. What do we feel like when we get sick? Like when you get the flu? What do you feel like? Why do you feel that way? And what chemical signals are causing you to feel that way? Think about those three questions. Well, what do you feel like when you get the flu? Fatigue, greatly amplified by exertion. You have trouble thinking, you're achy, and you don't want to move around much. You have a headache, poor appetite, poor sex drive. Many people with ME/CFS use the phrase almost exactly. It's like having the flu, except that it never goes away. That's what we feel like. So why do we feel that way? This is something, by the way, if you look at your pets when they get sick, it's not hard to tell that they're sick. They're moping around. They're not that interested in eating. They appear to be suffering the same symptoms that you feel when you get sick. This, in fact, these sickness symptoms and the behaviors that follow are found throughout the entire animal kingdom. So they've been preserved throughout evolution, and they've probably been preserved for a reason. What's the reason? Well, how do they change our behavior when we have those symptoms? We're much less active physically and mentally. We sleep much more. We eat and digest less. We have less sex. And as a result, we utilize a lot less energy. And that preserves the energy molecules that we have to fight the infection. That's why those symptoms that lead to that behavior have been preserved when we get sick, because nature wants us to have as many energy molecules as possible to fight the infection. That's what the theory says. As I said, this is seen in most animals, even in vertebrates. It's preserved in the most primitive of animals. It's a temporary response to injury and infection that focuses the body's energy stores on fighting the infection or healing the injury. And in people with post-infectious fatigue, the stimulus that triggers the sickness symptoms and behavior seems to persist. We'll discuss how that might be. The theory holds that the central condition that is triggering these ongoing symptoms is neuroinflammation, or activation of the brain's immune system. The theory goes further to say that there are, in fact, some neurons in the brain, the cells in the brain that do the thinking and feeling. There are neurons whose only function is to generate these symptoms when we get sick. A sickness nucleus or a sickness symptoms nucleus. In a talk at NIH in 2019, I postulated that this group of neurons might exist in the hypothalamus, particular part of the brain. What does the theory say triggers this group of neurons, this sickness nucleus, to produce all of those symptoms? It's activation of the brain's innate immune system. The immune system, when it's activated, produces chemicals that it uses sort of to orchestrate the army of the immune system that goes into battle. And those chemicals, we know through scientific experiments, produce many of these symptoms that we experience when we get sick. In fact, they are what is making us feel sick. What activates the brain's immune system? Well, an infection or an injury to the brain itself would do it. But what we've learned in recent years is so can inflammation outside of the brain in other parts of the body. When some other part of the body gets inflamed, like the gut, say, it sends signals through the blood and up nerves that head to the brain that activate the immune system in the brain. So in one person, some smoldering infection or injury of the brain, or in other people, inflammation outside the brain, both can activate the immune system in the brain, which then triggers the sickness nucleus, which then produces the symptoms. So how could these three microbe causes of long COVID be producing those symptoms? Viruses that are already in the brain that are reawakened by COVID, like for which there's evidence Epstein-Barr virus and some other herpes viruses could do it. So could an infection with viruses outside the brain through systemic inflammation. And if the virus alters the gut microbiome that leads to inflammation of the wall of the gut, that too could signal to the nucleus, the sickness nucleus in the brain, that there was inflammation in the body and the symptoms result. So that's when this model was first presented, it was pretty clear that these parts of it, that the viral infection of the brain or the virus producing systemic inflammation outside the brain, that could do it. But what wasn't clear was there any such sickness nucleus? That was just a theory. However, in the last several months, really, there have been a series of papers in the most prestigious journals of biology reporting exactly these nuclei, a group of them, in the hypothalamus, in the brain stem, that at least in mice, we don't know yet in humans, but many things that are true of a mouse's brain are true of the human brain, that there exist such nuclei dedicated to producing these symptoms. So that part of the theory at least looks a little less theoretical than it did several years ago. So, in summary, ME/CFS and long COVID have underlying biological causes. In my opinion, there now should be no question about that. This includes the infectious agent that triggers some cases, all cases of long COVID, some cases of ME/CFS, immune activation, neuroinflammation, autoantibodies, dysautonomia, which is abnormalities of the autonomic nervous system, oxidative stress, defective energy metabolism, hypometabolic state, and a pro-inflammatory gut microbiome. Secondly, these underlying abnormalities are all connected. They can reinforce each other. They can cause vicious cycles. They make it harder on one hand to fix the problem, but on another, they could make it easier if by absolutely shutting down one of these abnormalities, we could quiet the other abnormalities that talk to it. They probably cause the chronic sickness symptoms by stimulating a group of neurons in our brains, although in humans, such a group hasn't yet been identified. And those neurons are activated by inflammation in the brain or signaled to the brain from inflammation elsewhere in the body. The economic burden of long COVID and of other long-term sequelae of COVID-19 just in the United States may be approaching $4 trillion over the next decade. The number of people seeking disability could double over the next couple of years. The number of people meeting criteria for ME/CFS could also at least double. And fortunately, NIH and CDC have invested more heavily in research around this group of problems than they ever have in the past. If the research on long COVID leads to answers for ME/CFS, which I'm hopeful that it will, but time will tell. That will be good news for everyone. But as I look back over the first time I talked to this group, which was close to 40 years ago, I think about back then when there were a handful of people, really a small handful of people in the country, in the world, who were interested in the problem. I mean, people in biomedical community. Not very many people outside the biomedical community who had ever heard about such a problem or cared much about it. Virtually no money spent on research into the problem. No knowledge at all of, at that time, 40 years ago, of any objective underlying biological abnormalities. In fact, doctors would often say to me back then, but you know, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong, meaning that when I do all of the usual tests that I do in my patients, they all come back normal. So they would conclude that means there's nothing wrong. Well, the problem with that logic, of course, is if you're not ordering the right tests, then the fact that they all come back normal should not be reassuring. But it has taken 40 years. But now what some doctors say to me is, well, there's nothing wrong. They don't say that anymore. Now they say, how can all of these things be wrong? Well, the answer is because they're all connected to one another, because they all affect each other. When one gets worse, they tend to make the other things worse. And it's perfectly logical that so many of these connected things should be wrong. And they all, the good news is, they all offer targets for treatment. Because if you can target and shut down any of them, you have a chance of simultaneously shutting down other abnormalities as well. So today, I think back on a time when few people were interested in the problem and we knew nothing about it. And now 40 years later, we know a good deal more. Do we know enough to cure it? No. I wish we did, but we don't yet. And unfortunately, there's a lot of diseases that we've known about for a lot longer than 40 years. We also haven't yet figured out how to cure. But I believe the way you figure out cures is through science. And scientifically, we know a great deal more today than we did 40 years ago. So just in summary, I think that the advent of long COVID has had the very unhappy consequence of making a lot of more people sick with a chronic illness for which we don't yet have a definitive cure. But it has awakened the recognition on many, many people that these kinds of post-infectious fatigue syndromes are a very real thing with potentially huge economic consequences, that they're not limited to COVID and a handful of other infectious diseases that I talked about earlier, but if and when there's a next pandemic, as there certainly will be, there will be the problem with the chance with that pandemic for the same sort of residual chronic debilitating illness. So now is the time. 40 years ago was the time, but now certainly is the time to really get on top of what is going on scientifically with this similar group of illnesses, which likely share underlying biology and may share some common effective treatments, to learn about them and figure out how they will help improve the health of everyone who has been forced to suffer with them. So I'll stop with that. Thank you again for inviting me to talk. 40 years ago was a long time, but we're still at it. And we know a lot more than we did 40 years ago. That's reassuring. Thanks so much. After the break, we'll open it up for questions.